5 EST. Thanks for joining us in the meantime. Okay, I think we will go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome everyone to our third session of Art and Politics in our year-long series on understanding systemic racism, which is sponsored by the Ambedkar Initiative, hosted at the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society. I'd like to begin by thanking our co-sponsors, the Barnard Provost's Office, the Deans of Humanities and Social Science, and the EVP at Columbia, the institutes such as CSER, CGT, ERAS, IRCPL, the South Asia Institute, as well as the Department of Misas, the Columbia University Libraries, and CU Press. This set of conversations occurs in the context of a broad and comparative reckoning with racism and its violent histories around the world, and it happens in the midst of a great transformation of public and political life. As we celebrate Black History Month, we also take inspiration from the anti-caste legacies of B.R. Ambedkar and reflect on his continued relevance to discussions about social justice, affirmative action, and democratic thinking in a global frame. Next week, we'll have a wonderful session with poet, activist, and critic Meena Kandasamy, who will be in conversation with Dhanya Adanki, followed by a rare discussion and a reading by the Kannada writer Devanura Mahadeva 2 weeks from now, who will be in conversation with literary historian and cultural critic Prithvidatta Chandrashobhi. Today's session is on the Dalit Panthers and literary insurgence. We have with us Yogesh Maitreya, who's taking a PhD at the Tata Institute of Social Science in Mumbai. Yogesh also runs the important independent publishing house, Panther's Paw, which has been actively reviving the long tradition of Dalit and anti-caste writing. We also have with us Suraj Yengde, the author of the best-selling Caste Matters, host of the well-known column Dalitality in the Indian Express, among his many, many other accomplishments and accolades. Now, 2022 will mark the 50th anniversary of the Panther Manifesto, which marked the emergence of a radical new voice, one that actively drew on word, sound, and image to challenge the status quoism of Dalit politics of the time, especially the RPI, the Republican Party of India and Maharashtra. And it put forward the imagination of Dalit as a horizon, a name that pointed to the possibility of a distinctive commingling of global revolution, together with the reimagination of solidarity across caste and class, and other forms of minoritized or subaltern identity. Indeed, the use of our term today is a direct descendant of this moment in many ways. Led by the likes of Namdev Dhasal, Raja Dhale, both of whom are no longer with us, sadly, Zavi Pawar, who's produced a recent important work on the Panther and the history of the Dalit Panthers. Arjun Dhangle, whose well-known Poison Bread really inaugurated, I think, a shift or a focus towards translation, English translation of Dalit writing, and many others. The moment of the Dalit Panthers also indexed a certain sort of masculinist formation, one that privileged the life of the streets and forms of subaltern social experience that found literary expression even as they channeled a long history of literary experiment, especially in Marathi. Indeed, Dalit literature in the hands of the Panthers was Marathi modernism at its very best. So today we'll follow our usual format as we move into our engagement with our speakers. Each of our speakers will have 20 minutes with time for Q&A afterwards from the audience. I'll connect groups of questions and pose them to our speakers. Thank you all again, as I said, for attending. And we're really thrilled in particular to host this event, which is an occasion to commemorate foremothers and forefathers in the Dalit Panther movement at the moment. And there will be more to come next year around this particular issue. And please stay tuned for that. I've asked Yogesh to speak a little bit about the history of the little magazines, as well as the public and the political culture in Bombay that produced the Panthers as a phenomenon. I've also asked if he can link this with some comments about his own publishing house, the institutional constraints and the serious financial constraints that are posed to people who are engaged in working independently, and in particular thinking about a press like Panther's Paw. And I've asked both he and Suraj if they will do some reading for us in Marathi so that you can hear the voice, as it were, of the Panthers. Suraj himself, I've requested to say a little bit about the global context of Panther production, links with African American literature, and the early history again of some of those connections, those global connections, which he has also written about in great detail as a way to frame some of our conversations today. Thank you, Yogesh and Suraj, very, very much for joining us. And I think I'll hand the floor over to Yogesh now.
Thank you, Anupama, and thank you all of you who have joined. Uh, I'll be speaking very brief about like what Anupama has, asked me to, speak on. So, I mean, today, like, the title of this talk is like, the political aesthetics. So, I mean, I understand this particular, topic in a very like from a very organic perspective. So let me like start with a brief history of little magazine movement. So little magazine movement was spread across almost 3 decades, like 1950s, 60s and 70s, and it was not limited to the state of Maharashtra, but it was there in Bengal, it was there in even in Punjab, and it was there in other states also. But I'll be focusing on Maharashtra. Now, 47 was like independence, and then 56 was a Buddhist conversion. So when we look at the state of Maharashtra and what has given rise to Dalit Panthers movement, so if you go back to the the years when Dr. Ambedkar was politically active, and to the year of 1956 when mostly Mahas were converted to Buddhism. Now he focused on he focused on many things for the emancipation of Dalit community. But one thing which Mahar carried throughout their life was education. Now Maharashtra as a linguistic state formed in 1961, and a lot of people, like even the liberals from the Savarna community or the Savarna caste, they also contributed in, like making a state of Maharashtra, the people of, the state of Marathi people. Now, when Maharashtra was formed in 1961, uh, it was still, we have roughly three or four region in Maharashtra. One is Vidarbha, one is we call Pashchim Maharashtra, which is Western Maharashtra. There is a Konkan, and there is a Khandesh. So Dalits from all, like all parts of Maharashtra, like, especially from Konkan and Paschim Maharashtra or Marathwada, they went to Bombay in search of, newly starting their life, especially upon the call of Ambedkar, that move from villages to cities, aspire from new life, aspire for life you can invest in education and make your life, better, and get rid of the local casteist feudal structure, which is which are replicated in Indian villages, or Indian villages are a replication of that particular structure. So a lot of Dalits, and Dalits from all over India, they started coming to, especially, Bombay became a epicenter of migration. Now this was 1916. If you are talking about 1961, now lot of people from various linguistics background, they started coming, they started coming to Bombay to search for a new life. And the Dalits, especially from Maharashtra, who went to move to Bombay, they went in search of, a life, especially the life of mind, which Ambedkar says, so now the social fabric of Bombay was such that there were so many people, like, Bombay was at that time was, a kind of a small replica of the entire India. You find people of all religion, people of all linguistic backgrounds. Even there were Chinese people there. I mean, few of them are still there. Now it makes a Bombay a very fascinating place, a cosmopolitan in true sense. Yet when people came, they also came with their caste, like not only Dalits migrated to Bombay, but other people also migrated to, Bombay. So linguistically, this particular city, like which was later, people started calling it Mumbai. Now, uh, in especially, like, talking about in a sense of language, or in the context of language, it people from a lot various castes, people from various linguistic background, have made, made the like the fabric of language very unique. Some people call it a Bombaya language, which is very unique to Bombay, and no, you don't find anywhere anywhere else in India. So this was a kind of a rough background, like, till 70s. Now, when we say that, how this is related to the rise of Dalit Panthers, or the literature which has produced when Dalit Panther came into being. Now, uh, like little magazines, they shifted their focus from, how traditional literature was being written. Now they started writing about what they see in front of their eyes, or what are their experiences in of being in Bombay. And Bombay was like a multicultural life, a life in which you can find a small India, a replication of it. Now, although they shifted their focus from, imaginary to realism, or, to like started writing literature with the realist approach, yet their sensibilities were, mostly Savarnas, because little majority of the people who, started little magazine, except Raja Dale and quite a few people, because if you read the dominant history of, or the history which is about the Dalit Little Magazine movement, you don't find Raja Dhale's name into that. But Raja Dhale was one of the pioneer of the Little Magazine movement in 60s, because he was also a painter. He was also an illustrator and calligrapher, alongside being a poet. Now, because this, but Little Magazine, the kind of literature Little Magazine movement has produced was different than the traditional Marathi literature was there. Now, people thought it is a progressive literature, or the literature which is liberating the body of the existence of literature. But if you find, like, if you go through their sensibilities, they were still savarnas. Now, it was like this until 70s, until 1972, when Dhasal's Golpita came into being, when it was published in 1972, which was also the year of formation of Dalit Panther. Now, we have two people, two Dalit, who are, like, extremely important, significant, and uh, a poet of who break the the traditional, or even they shifted their approach from the liberal or the progressive literature from Maharashtra. They were like Namdev Dasal and Raja Dhale. Now, both, the way they have written their poetry or literature in Marathi was different in tone. Namdev's life represent the everyday life of Bombay, and the life which even the common people do not have access to. So Namdev's literature or his poems are like very unique to his experiences, because even Raja Dhale did not even have that experience, because, like, like, when Raja Dhale was like a first generation learner, educated, and Dasal did not have that access to education, but like I mean, of course, to the academic education. So he remained this what he called himself a lumpen proletariat. So this, as uh, what has changed the picture of literary sensibilities, as well as the approach to language, was the publication of Golpita. Now, Namdev has written about, it's a Golpita is a particular place where Namdev was born and raised, it's Kamatipura basically, it was there. So his life was very unique to, like, his experiences are very unique to the kind of life he lived. So, and we do not find this kind of originality in the literature of other Dalit writers, because most of them came from a academic background, first generation learner, MA, or maybe poets in university, professors, or teachers or lecturers in colleges and universities. So we find Namdev's language is very unique, and it stands out even now because of the kind of life he lived. Now, when the Golpita came, people, like, people, even most of the Savarnas of that time, the Marathi critics especially, it was hard for them to digest, or even to read and to understand what actually has been written, because they were totally unknown to the sensibilities, the world, even the metaphors, even the imageries, even the figure of speech which Dasal used. Now, later, many people try to emulate, or try to copy that in their poetry, but which was like essentially impossible thing to do especially in poetry. uh Now, this has changed something, like uh, people started getting inspired from Panther literature and all these things. But the kind of literature Panthers produce, it is a part and parcel of the fight they have fought on the road. Now, Raja Dhale, Javi Pawar, Namdev Dusar, Arun Kamre, Bhagwat Jadhav, there are a lot of people, some people are still unknown to us. Now, whatever the literature they have produced still remain unique to their sensibilities, or their time, or the kind of life they led. Now, uh, when, like, 70s and 80s until 90s, this impact was there. But once there was this, what you call in understand in India as LPG, like liberalization, privatization, globalization, and the kind of life Dalits are going to lead after, or after this period, was something, something, uprooted their sensibilities from, thinking or originally in terms of poetry, because a lot of people, like, you know and one of the drawbacks of, drawbacks of 90s is that till 90s, in Dalit literature, poetry and autobiographies were dominating the scene of literature. But it was, like, it was delimited to that. Like, we rarely moved to the domain of novels and to the domains of short stories. Of course, we have, like, exceptions like Babura Bagul, and, I mean, these are the prominent name come in our mind. But except that, we did not move beyond poetry, or, uh, uh, I mean, basically autobiographies and poetry. Now, when I think about, when I went to Bombay, moved to Bombay in 2016, sorry, 2013. I was, like, to do my MA in TISS, Tata Institute of Social Sciences. I mean, this place was totally, a kind of, like, when I was in that place, I felt that, it was something very alienated from the real Bombay. I started meeting people, like, I started engaging with the people from the movement, and subsequently with the movement. Now, from them, I got this, you know uh, uh, understanding that the kind of life we live, academic, or the academic spaces are hardly able or equipped with, these resources and everything, which can actually help us to produce the original, or the originality in terms of literature we want to produce. Now, in academics, we were asked to write or talk in particular, use these particular terminologies, or we were introduced to, or maybe unknowingly we started using those. But the kind of life I came from, the kind of experiences I had, it was being very difficult for me to articulate that in English. And when I even express that, when I formulate that, it doesn't sound like English, because uh, I never read that in English. I never read I never read that those contexts, like the context from which I came from. I'm not saying that, like, these are very unique, but what I'm saying is, like, these are generational changes, and with every generation something change, something change, like your ideas to understand, or and to read the language also change. Now, one thing I learned from engaging with the people of the Panthers in Bombay during my 7 years stay there is that if you have a story, you need to be the writer as well as the producer of it. I think basically that was the purpose of Little Magazine. That was also the purpose of literature which was produced during Panther, by Panther, and of Panthers, the people who were associated, the writer and the poets who were associated with the Panthers movement. Now, I was thinking, my thought process was about how we can produce the stories, if not about how we can write about the stories. Because the language in which I wanted to write was English, and I did not see any kind of, a kind of a hope or a kind of a enthusiasm in English publication which can produce the kind of story I want to produce. Recently, I published a 22-year Dalit writer, and he's the grandson of barrister Rajabhau Khobragade. He's a well-known personality, like in Dalit movement and Dalit political movement. Now he just wanted, he asked me to write. He asked me that he wanted to write a story of his great grandmother. I said, write it. And he's a 22-year-old, very young writer, never published, never written anything, and he's a law graduate. But he wanted to write a story, and he wrote. I like managed to get it edited, get it like worked on it and get it published. Now there are a lot of views are coming about it, like people are pouring their opinions about it. But like I'm telling you, like as an example, that why I chose and what I learned from Panthers, or what I learned from these years, in which progressive, in which progressive are the literature of a liberal people uh, was produced in Maharashtra. Now I thought that I learned one thing, that unless and until I produce my own stories, I mean, of course, like I'll be the like I'm the teller of my story, I'm the writer of my story, but I also need to be the producer of my stories. Otherwise, my story can be the commodity for other people. So that is one thing I learned from my engagement with Dalit Panther, especially with Mr. Javi Pawar, because my only focus was like about literature which was produced during Panther, before that and after that, and uh, uh, listening about that, reading about that, I came to an understanding that especially like in the domain of English language in India, our stories are either produced by other people. Sometimes we may be the writer, but it is produced by other people. But there are hardly any any producer which like who are Dalits in English, the domain of English language. So it was the same story which was there with the all other languages. Languages in India are dictated by Brahmins, and I think no one else. Whether it is English, or I mean traditionally, things might have been changed for few decades, but this was the beginning. They were the dictators of language, whatever it is language, and also the English. So I wanted to focus on this particular aspect. A Dalit should be Dalit or Bahujan is a writer. He is going to be the producer of the story. He or she is going to be the producer of their own stories, because as I said that, like, if we don't produce our stories will be commodity for other people to accumulate the capital, or whatever capital, in terms of cultural or social or intellectual. So I need to be a writer as well as the producer of my stories, and that is something triggered me to be or get into publication.
Thanks. Thank you, Yogesh. Do you think maybe you want to read a couple of poems, maybe as a way to kind of help us to move into Suraj, or would you like to think about a couple of other things you wanted to speak to?
Uh, I, I mean, I can read out one story of, sorry, a poem, which is, this is a poem by Dasal, and it's about his mother. So, sure, I'll recite that.
Please.
Uh, आई शहरात आली देहाचं झाडवात घेऊन, कष्ट खस्ता उपसल्या भोगल्या, शिड्या भाकरीचे तुकडे मोडून, तरीही तिचा अद्भुताचा शोध चालूच. तिच्या देहातली वांदेही अशी झंकारत राहायची. तिच्या देहातली वाद्यही अशी झंकारत राहायची. चिक्कार पाहिलं, भोगलं आईनेही. शहरातही तिने तवलीत अन्न शिजवलं. पैठणीचे रंग न्याहाळताना न्याहाळताना जुनेराला ठिगडं लावलं. बापा अगोदर मरून तिनं असं अहेव पण जिंकलं. आई अगोदर बाप मेला असता तरी मला त्याचं काही वाटलं नसतं. दुःख याचं आहे. तोही तिच्या करारात सामील होता. So when you ask, like Anupama, when you ask me that, this the question of gender and sexuality, and especially the literature which was produced during Panther. Now, I read this poem particularly because it is it tells you the position or the imagination of a woman in the life of a Dalit male. Now, the last two line is three line. आई अगोदर बाप मेला असता तरी मला त्याचं काही वाटलं नसतं. दुःख याचं आहे. तोही तिच्या करारात सामील होता. If my father would have died before my mother, I would have never felt anything, and I have pain of it. I mean, I am suffering because of it, because I would have not felt anything, because he was also involved in her agreement. And this agreement is basically nothing but the struggle which a Dalit man and a Dalit woman do for their generations. Now there are some things, there are maybe like there are male instincts which take place in between Dalit man and woman when they are husband and wife, or maybe their partners, but they are very different from how Savarna man and Savarna women interact with each other. Because what Dasal says, that my father was also involved in the agreement with my mother, because the agreement was of struggle. Both of them had to toil for their generations. So I think this poem is very, very symbolic to what you have asked. So I hope, like, it's a pretty profound poem. So I mean, that is the reason I read that. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Yogesh, and we'll have time to come back and speak with you. And maybe if you wanted to offer up anything else in terms of reading at that time, it'll be great to hear from you.
Sure.
I'll invite Suraj now, I think, to join us and to speak with us, and then we'll open up to the audience. Thanks, Suraj, again, and thank you very much, Yogesh, for your talk.
Thank you so much, Anu. It was profound to hear a Western Maharashtrian guy, Namdev Dasal, writing in Marathi and poem recited by Vidarbha. The kind of a complexity of music is very much present there. Anu, when you set this up about last year, I thought me and Yogesh will be in conversation. So I had no idea. I was just taking it. So when you sent an email last week uh, about having something to do with the Lit Panther and the kind of global aspect of it and the literature mostly, that really put me into work mode, and I and I appreciate that. So I was busy until Monday. So in the past 3 to 4 days, I have put together this. So and I thought I'll read it out, and there is a presentation I'll give. So this is the kind of a first time ever presentation. You guys are the witness of my fresh baked thoughts. I have not even edited whatever it is in on my screen. I'm gonna read out. I wanna Before I begin, I wanna pay gratitude to uh, the people who have attended, and more importantly, all the friends who are part of this movement, and we've been working together, thinking together. Um, Anu, specifically thank to you for continue to do this. Four people deserve mention and an acknowledgement for this talk today. Prashant Ingole out of IIT Gandhinagar, who made readily available literature of Janardhan Wagmare. Jaipal Gaikwad, who sent me the quest of Black identity on his download on his phone and sent, and Nivedita Pantavani, the editor now of Asmita Darsh, about whom I'll talk, and obviously Dr. Rajendra Gunarkar from Nanded University, my hometown, for also connecting me with Janardhan Wagmare. Um, I don't have much to. I think you guys can see my slides. Um,
Yes, we can.
okay, great, terrific. Wait, this is how I don't know how to navigate this. Sorry, I'll just I don't know how to do the both uh
I
both.
think you just use your the clicker to go forward from one to the other on your slideshow.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. I didn't knew that. Da, 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 da. Okay, there we go. Okay, I assume you can see this. And can you see that my paper here also?
Yes.
So you can see both, or you can only see one screen.
No, we can only see the screen that has the PPT, the Dalit Black Idea
And
Sphere.
you okay? That's great. That's what I want to know. Okay, thank you. Uh, I call this talk Dalit Black Idea Sphere, and in that I thought to look at Dalit Panther is to check the incidents and traditions that gave rise to them, the thought and as well as the pre-thought of Dalit Panther movement. The emphasis of Dalits drawing inspiration from Black literature is correct, but not in its entirety. There were certainly exchanges, but Dalit literary genre existed in autonomy. Ambedkar became the father of Dalit literary imagination. Modern Dalit literary sphere did exist prior to Ambedkar's influential entry in the national domain in 1920s. Literary sphere existed in forms and shape as journalistic ventures very much equivalent to African American press. However, the difference between Dalit and Black literary sphere was somewhat different nature. The grand uncle of uh, the grand uncle of Marathi literature, Gopal Baba Walankar, wrote furiously with subtle fervor for the newspapers like Din Mitra, Sudharak for a long period of time. Walankar's Vital Vidwansak in 1888 attacked caste Hindu supremacy of Brahmins, especially the protagonist Shankaracharya. Shivraj Anma Kamale's Somunche Mitra in 1988 can be credited as the second Marathi Dalit newspaper in India and the third Dalit newspaper in entire India outside Maharashtra. The first one, of course, was edited by Fagoji Bansode, who edited Maratha Dinbandhu in 1901, Anteye Vilap 1906, Maharansa Sudharak 1907. And of course, being a labor union activist, he edited Mazdoor Patrika for the mill activists and mill workers in Nagpur, and also wrote biography of Chokha Mela. Bansode was also a well-known poet whose poetry turned out to be notable for Dalit activists and writers 50 years later. However, in Tamil Nadu also, Ayutthas pioneered Oru Paisa Tamilan in 1907. This history is important for us to really place what were the literary antecedents to what we saw in 1970s, mostly 60 onwards, emergence of radical Dalit literature. I talk about the cross-referencing of the Dalit Black idea sphere. Ambedkar was the first to cross-reference African American literature from the Dalit side. In his monumental essay written in 1930s, mostly in response to Lala Lajpat Rai's litany of rebuttals to Catherine Mayo's controversial Mother India, Rai suggested that untouchability was of relative value compared to slavery in America. Ambedkar lambasted Rai in his famous text, which is worse, Slavery or Untouchability. Ambedkar looks at the dynamics of slavery and untouchability, arguing for the non-value of an untouchable body. Much of his thesis on American slavery was drawn from the famous Charles Johnson's book, The Negro in American Civilization, a study of Negro life and race relations in light of social science, social research, published in 1930s in New York. This could be credited as the first Dalit correspondence with African American literary sphere. Other newspapers that also supported Ambedkar's movement were Garud, started by Dadasaheb Shirke in 1926, Dalit Bandhu, started by P.N. Raj Bhoj in 1928, Patit Pawan by Patit Pawan Das, Maharatha by Helen Hardas, Dalit Ninad, among others. V.N. Barve also brought in Gandhian perspective to propagate the anti-caste views. Ambedkar did not pick up from African American space as much. However, later generations of Dalits did pay enough attention to develop a what they call Dalit Negro Sahitya. A prominent protagonist of this was M.N. Wankhede, who arrived to write his doctoral thesis in 1966, in 1960, in 1960s, early 1960s, at University of Florida, Gainesville. Wankhede submitted his dissertation, Walt Whitman and Tantrism, a comparative study. A year later, he returned to assume the charge of principal of the very influential and prestigious Dalit Education Center, Milan College in Aurangabad. From there, he edited the periodical Prabuddha Bharat, and obviously we see the cross-referencing of this literature repeatedly in his writing. After Wankhede's arrival, he was set out to launch newer studies in comparative literature in this direction. Under his mentorship, Janardhan Wagmare was shaped, who ended up writing the first ever critical thesis on Black and Dalit thought. Through the literature of Ralph Ellison, James Baldwin, Langston Hughes, American condition was analyzed. This literary undertaking educated the Dalit audience about Black culture and their problems in slavery, post-slavery, Jim Crow, and the civil rights struggle. The window to African American life was effectively caricatured through the Black literature. Now I'll talk about Asmita Darsh, a very influential magazine to have existed and which continues to be published. Was launched in 1967. It was considered as the first watershed moment in the history of Indian Dalit literature. Gangadhar Pantavne, an A scholar, researcher, and mentor to many, took over the editorial role in 1968 and edited the magazine for 50 years. Pantavne wrote 20 books and edited 13 more. The vision of Pantavne was to raise non-Dalit writers as well, especially Shudras and nomadic tribes. His way of operating with Dalit, non-Dalit, and as well as the Savarna sphere proved fruitful. Many writers who couldn't find an independent space, who were non-Dalit, found a home in Dalit literary house, Asmita Darsh. They were welcomed and made part of the Dalit literature as Dalits. Pantavne revisited much of the Dalit essence through literature and social commentary. He remained loyally devoted to his primary field of investigation, literature, and through it introduced host of new scholars, writers, and also organized literary festivals. One of the festivals of which he was president was the first international Marathi festival, literary festival organized in San Jose. In an article published in 1983 for Barbara Joshi's edited collection Untouchable Voices of Dalit Liberation Movement, Pantavne expands the category of Dalit. Here he argues Dalit is a living condition. It is an archetype, I quote, of the exploited men in his country, unquote. For Pantavne, Dalit is not a caste. It is a symbol of change and revolution. Dalit is a person that has an agency to act and direct. Dalit simply believes in humanism, and I am quoting him, rejects the existence of God, rebirth, soul, sacred books that teach discrimination, fate, and heaven, end quote. The Dalit does this because, Pantavne adds, they have made him slave, end quote. Like Pantavne, Babau Rao Bagul, another giant literary figure in India's political as well as social scene, intervened to interpret the Dalit condition by offering a meaning to the outcasted term. He defined Dalit as someone who is seeking total liberation and revival of their pride. Obviously, Bagul is credited to be one of the founding fathers of India's Dalit literary writing, and rightfully so. These existing tropes of radical Dalit thought rooted in the humanist vision of Ambedkar and Buddha, with occasional interventions of left thought, brought out new parameters of rebelling. In this light, Janardhan Wagmare took over the Cutgirls to work on the comparative theme of Dalit and Black literature. This puts him in the brave school of Phule's thought of Satya Shodak, truth-seeking society, very much inheriting in that comparative legacy as well. Janardhan Wagmare himself belonging to the Mali caste of the Gardner caste, to which Phule also belonged. Wagmare is perhaps the only scholar to have single-handedly shaped the genre of comparative literature in India. A personal pride to me, Wagmare inserted a Marathwada region, where I come from, voice from the 1960 onwards with the feet of critique and drum of comparative discourse in India and US. Wagmare wrote several articles on the comparisons of Black Dalit literature. He called it, I quote, Negro Dalit Sahitya, the phase of Negro, Black, Afro-American to being an African American marks the phase of looking at America as a process, and Wagmare resorts to follow the trail loyally through African American writers of post-war, Great War period. He does this in his only English language book, The Quest for Black Identity, published in 2001 by Sugawa in Pune. This book took shape after many gaps that came in Wagmare's life while writing the thesis as well as preparing the manuscript. It was a book that aimed to study, I quote him, Black Americans' problem of identity in post-war American Black novel. And Wagmare, of course, in his introduction, or rather first chapter, describes how America is obsessed with identifying itself through an identity discourse. I think that was one of the sharpest or earliest analysis to really look at America as an identitarian nation, as a nation that is obsessed with identities early in 1970s and 80s. And I think he could get that from Baldwin and Ellison, two of his primary source of investigation for his PhD. In an article entitled American Negro Vanme, Prerna Ani Pravrutti, American Negro Literature, Motivation and Tendency, Wagmare surveys Black literature, right from the era of post-bellum to the contemporary era of post-civil rights. Emphasizing the uniqueness of Black literature, Wagmare argues that because Black people's experience in America have been different since inception, it was only natural that those differences and experiences found its way into Black literature of America, thereby making Black literature of America a different enterprise. Even though different, the Black literature could win an independent space and place in American literature. Black writers created ways for sensibilities, inspirations, and attitudes in literature because they wanted to create a new image of themselves, Wagmare argued. Black literature was found in an attempt of the descendants of slaves who were brutally uprooted from their motherland, disturbed from their culture, family, and religion. In this quest to search for racial history, culture, and pride, Black literature, Wagmare argued, was formed and shaped. Wagmare takes notice of this changing landscape of American racial politics and thereby the literature's poignant role in offering historical interpretation. He registers the phase of post-1930s as being prakhar, intense. This phase led to the foundation of new Black literature. Among the pioneers of this movement, Wagmare credited Claude McKay, Countee Cullen, and Langston Hughes. During this phase, three prominent names created waves that gained in international attention. Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison, and James Baldwin wrote to rewrite their self. The later two, Ellison and Baldwin, were Wagmare's subjects of inquiry for his doctoral thesis that he submitted to Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar Marathwada University in Aurangabad. Wagmare observed the state of Prakhar Yug, the intense epoch in Black literature, was guided under the stewardship of Richard Wright. Wright was an important figure because he departed from earlier norms of literary writing that Wagmare saw lacking, quote, abundance, diversity, and depth, end quote. Wagmare saw this due to the historical mischief done by white Americans who, I quote, cut the wings of Blacks, which limited their fight to explore various horizons, end quote. Thus, Richard Wright's presence was monumental and influential in many sense. Due to his communist leanings, his protagonist was willing to be violent and therefore untamed. Native Son, Wagmare proceeds, brought an earthquake to each American, making Wright America's celebrated Dostoevsky. Native Son is responsible for changing American culture, Wagmare argued profusely, for it not only made everyone think about Bigger Thomas, the subversion of nigger term and protagonist of Native Son, but also it inspired next generation of writers to take on responsibilities. However, due to Bigger Thomas's character as violent rapist and anguished, much of the newer generation was uncomfortable upholding him. In the list of these new protesters that came to be known as protest literature, Ellison and Baldwin went to become the front heads along with Zora Neale Hurston. Baldwin, Wagmare, very much in awe, asserts that he courageously inserted sexuality, gender into the American Black experience heretofore unknown. The protest phase from intense phase to the phase of protest, there was a third space that gave rise to what he called tranquility phase, or what he called crescent period. That that was short and sweet as crescent that trails in the dark sky with a silver curve symbolizing tranquility of mind. Why did he call crescent period? Because he saw post World War American situation as being adaptable to much of the discourses that was not seen before in the black literature. Wagmare communicated to his Marathi reader how effective can a literature be to change the society and influence culture. Through the citations of African American moves, Wagmare was alerting to the Dalit community to grapple the significance of letters and extraordinary power of opinion in making desired changes. Literature was not only a matter of bohemia or entertainment or leisure. In fact, it was to create changes on each level of society. Dalit literature, unlike black literature, which took about 40 to 50 years to be registered as radical, started off as powerful response with radical calculated risks because it had Ambedkar and his radicalism as its ideal, Wagmare argued. I'll just end with uh, last phase. Much of the interest that intersected with black literature had Dalit and caste as its simultaneous focus. In his article, Negro Vanmay Ani Dalit Chawad, Negro Literature and Dalit Movement, Wagmare comparatively looks at Dalit and black community in India and US respectively. He observed that unlike the black community of America, Dalits were born in India and had roots in their motherland. Irrespective of this relative advantage of being from the same land, Dalits couldn't become the owners of country and ruling class of their society. या देशाचा तो वारसदार असूनही त्याला वारसा हक्क प्राप्त झाला नाही. Even being the inheritor of this country, the Dalit couldn't own the inheritance. An analogy of slavery was drawn to the Varna system that created a Dalit outcast which was put quote into peculiar institution. He incorrectly stated that race was natural division while caste was man-made. This theory was, of course, refuted by Ambedkar, like Du Bois, and many social scientists of the 20th century. Biologism as a scientific doctrinaire was subsided by the anti-caste activists and scholars. Race, like caste, is man-made. The inflexibility of both, however, remains. The broader similarities between black and Dalit condition was identified structurally. Both Dalits and African Americans are lowest in the hierarchy of their society. Like black Americans are segregated in ghettos, so are Dalits in their own caste ghettos. This separation from society brought in them, quote, self-hatred and self-loathing, end quote. And of course, that gave rise to what they saw as criminality. To retain this unequal structure, the whites of America used myths and stories of Bible to legitimize their actions, very much like the Hindus used Vedas and Manusmriti. In nutshell, Dalit and black writers describe this situation to the world from their unique vantage point that can be seen in unison. Both writers are in search of their common reality. Their experience in the literature is drawn from the society predicated on inequality. Black and Dalit writers write from the perspective of life with social responsibilities. However, as much as the comparison was promoted, there were many like Bhausaheb Adsul, Gangadhar Pantavne, and many others who took an odds with this obsessive African American reference to the Dalit literature. Some, like Adsul, observed importing the black experience into Dalit sphere as being an un-Indian, while Sharan Kumar Limbale endorsed the project of having a comparative framework. Pantavane differentiated between black and Dalits because untouchability differentiated both. Untouchability existed for Dalits, while untouchability did not necessarily existed through spiritual sanction among the black people. And I end with this Narhar Kurundkar's emphasis on how they looked at a black as well as Dalit literary genre coming to focus. Dalit perspectives always, Kurundkar attributes, was the black perspective for Dalit perspectives attributes the influence of such comparisons, especially bringing the black life to India would benefit, Kurunkar argued, Marathi literature by giving it support and shape. And Kurunkar here is writing preface to Janardhan Wagmare's book on Dalit and black literature. Kurumkar suggested that due to the black literature, the Marathi gentry would now find a discourse and space to read Dalit literature. This meant the apathy developed towards Dalit resistance and literature would now receive a welcoming grandstand because of black literature's power. This position is somewhat important to consider, especially when Dalit life and culture is looked down upon and hated for its charisma. A foreign perspective would help Dalit voice to get across the board was a prevalent sentiment. Here it is assumed that through the narrative of black victim, the Dalit victim will be recognized. So Dalit humanity can only exist in tandem with someone else's. Dalit cannot exist as an independent thinking being, let alone their suffering having to do anything with the rest of the country. Complicity here can only be gauged through an outsider white oppressor, but not a self-cast Hindu tormentor. Even today, Dalit as a body has to cite Black Lives Matter or borrow the Lives Matter discourse and slide the Dalit phenomena without making a huge noise. Dalit perspectives lay beneath the dignity of even recognition, acknowledging the presence of a dignified human being. Their cries and pains do not summon anyone's mind to think, let alone engage with the victim. Their numbness perhaps could be remedied if aggressor is shown in similar actions, causing damage to people in an entirely different, far too removed context. That is how black literature comes to rescue the dying Dalit response. The oppressor caste in India cannot empathize with the Dalit condition because they do not think of Dalit as a victim. They assume it is a pretense of a vile, disgusting, lazy Dalit body who is loudly clamoring against non-existence injustice. In this condition, to put across the rational Dalit viewpoint is an impossibility, thus showing a mirror in an indirect reference to similar forms of injustice existing elsewhere. A self-reflection, the quality of mature persons, becomes important that is absent in an Hindu public and private sphere. Thus, to empower the humanity of Dalit, the oppressors need to be made of their humanity, need to be made aware of their inhumanity. A direct telling to their face usually doesn't work because the deafening of Dalit discourse has become the norm of caste Vedic India. However, an exposition of cruel system in another society across the Atlantic might help the oppressor realize their participation in dehumanization of their lower made citizens. Irrespective of this, there are ample evidences where even after understanding the knowledge of oppression in other societies, the oppressor caste has not put a critical lens on him or herself. Instead, it made a phantasmic caricature of a structure and called it anything but the B, Brahminism. That is how diverse ideologies existed to fight back oppression, which did not call out Brahmin supremacy and Brahminic violence. The Gandhian approach patronized in an utterly demeaning way without realizing its violence upon the victims. The communist and left discourse, although inspired to create a peasant revolution, assumed itself as a class of peasantry by giving up of caste and class privileges. Class privilege can be given, but caste cannot when the system and society is committed to recognizing the other castes in humanity. In the same thread, the liberal class that believes in the centrist method of capitalist expansion also did not see itself as culprit, instead found out communalism and secularism as ideal metaphors to protect the vulnerable. In all these variant ideologies and frame of methods, nowhere did the oppressor identify him or herself as the aggravator of the Dalit victimhood. And unsurprisingly, these diverse ideologies do unite in their non-recognition of Dalit body politic. For them, a Dalit cannot exist as a sole category premised on the experiences of caste. They had to embrace their victimhood through the paradigms remotely unrelated to Dalit being, and in this case, a black being. That is why Dalits were made to put a face mask of peasant, worker, poor, rural, illiterate, destitute, and permanent victim without asking a Dalit to usher their voices in these coded frames. Entire gamut of academia, media, public scholarship, policy interventions, school education, NGOs, and international think out did not accentuate the soul of the victim. It judged it according to the artificiality of clothing draped by the weaver for their pleasure. Articulation of clear Dalit voice then became caricatured as, quote, radical, announcing anyone's identity without anyone else's dictionaries became an act of rebellion. This makes the Dalit a subject of outwardly cowardice and not internal bravery of themselves. Dalit and Dalit being is juxtaposition of their humanism. Dalit being acknowledging their Dalitness is a call to revisit the improper, untidy history being manipulated and falsely told by the oppressor savior. Similarly, Dalit visiting its Dalit being is to challenge the walls of unclear definitions. Thus, for a Dalit to be a Dalit is still unresolved. It is a work under construction. The question then remains, can Dalit be themselves without having the need to rely on another victim's narrative to make a genuine case for their humanity? Can we always see at Dalits in the clouds of black struggle and their quest for humanity? Or shall Dalits defy any projections of their codependency on anyone, be it resistance or internationalist movement for justice, to argue with the swagger of words and originality of being a dapper human? With these pronouncements, will these pronouncements need a vocabulary of Western lingua to pass the editorial checks of global North gatekeepers in funding agencies and academic departments? The over-enthusiastic elan of social media warriors and digital scribblers will ever find the rich archive not digitized yet to the codes of Google programming. Much of the Dalit modernity has to part two ways: a serious examination of past and deploying tools of modernity to create a place in the future. The enigma of Dalit Panthers is still alive because even if Dalit Panthers in its original form was disbanded, it created surrogates. Many Dalit Panther organizations were formed, and some of them are still in operation with public recognition. One of them, Yuva Panther, which I am one of the founding members. Much of the Republican movement is still taken by the progenies to the Panther Project. Thus, we cannot assume the Dalit Panther as a moment, but necessarily attribute it to the movement. It has been genuinely moving from doors and corridors, desperately trying to find a space in the political calculus of caste politics in India. To look at Dalits only through black lens puts enormous and undue responsibility on the already victimized black person. Black only gets recognized when they are criminalized or stereotyped. This condition warrants black oppression to occur as a result. Thus, for Dalit humanity to be acknowledged, can they afford to maintain another black death to be a channel of contact? Thank you.
Thanks very, very much, Suraj. And I want to give our guests a chance to think a little bit about, I think, two very, very profound talks. I also want to give you both the chance to be in conversation with each other a little bit before we open up to the audience. But a few things that really struck me thinking about both of your presentations. One, I think, is the question of translation, translatability, and the questions of social life, experience, and the kind of intense and specific urbanity of Bombay that Yogesh brought up as one of the kind of the contexts, if you will, for understanding both the rise of the Dalit Panthers, but then also the very particular kinds of literary productions of the moment. And then I think, Suraj, you're posing a number of questions. I mean, you ended really by asking for new forms of both external critique, that is, the forms of togetherness, thinking sociality, thinking indeed from the perspective of sort of Brahminical modes of knowledge and how we may break those down, in terms of really thinking through the question of humanity, dignity, respect, recognition for Dalit life, but also I think you're posing a very profound challenge from within. And this really kind of, structures, I think, your entire body of work, which is what are the forms of internal critique? What are the forms of kind of historicity that we need to be thinking about from within Dalit contexts of life as well as politics in order to think about new possibilities for insurgence, new ways of thinking about solidarity, and indeed, a space for insurgent and radical politics, however we choose to think about it, whether through, literary writing, experimentation, utopian perspectives, or sort of engagement on the ground. And as we see with the Panthers, these are all part and parcel of the everyday for them. It also seems to me that both Yogesh and Suraj, you really remind us that the Panthers are part and parcel of a very long history of Dalit and anti-caste writing. So you can think about Phule on down. So Valankar, of course, is very much part of the Satyashodak Samaj. He's brought in to the Samaj by Phule, and then experiences himself practices of untouchability that are being perpetrated by members of the Samaj as the Samaj transforms, as you know. So this line from Phule to Valankar to Kisan Phagoji Bansode in the Vidarbha region, but also Shivram Janba Kamble in Western India. And thinking about that and bringing that forward to people like Adsul and others who are already thinking about the long history of Dalit journalism and writing. We already begin to have that between the 40s and the 60s. Then you have something like Asmita Darsh and the moment of what you call global comparison, and what it both makes available to Dalit writers and Dalit literary critics on the one hand, but maybe also what it's closing off. And I take that as the moment where you're really saying that comparison opens up certain ways of thinking about language and linguistic experiment, but it also closes off other ways of thinking the specificity of caste, the perpetuation of casteism, and how we think about questions of complicity and responsibility. So that whole debate within Asmita Darsh, M.N. Wankhede, Janardhan Vaghmare, and Pantaune are all part of that moment. But you'll remember that there's a deep internal critique in Asmita Darsh too. It's something that gets played out, I think, in and amongst the Dalit Panthers as well. It has to do with the very term Dalit and what that means. Dhale, on the one hand, moving towards questions of radical humanism, the Buddhist legacy as a long history for thinking about Dalit identity. In fact, he's uncomfortable with the term Dalit by that time and later on. And then Namdev Dhasal, who, as Yogesh mentioned, is channeling a certain kind of heterodox Marxism. You see this in R.B. More, whose autobiography we've just published, but as well with Baburao Bagul. We can see this with Anna Bhausate, and that tradition, which is channeling but also really profoundly transforming the kind of communist or the Marxist discourse or vocabulary. And the Dhasal Dale sort of conflict really takes shape around this, right? So is Dalit going to be a kind of horizon for thinking caste and class? Or do we have to think about other histories? And I think that's a very, very rich and resonant history that continues to be with us today as well. But this is just to mark some of the very important things that both of you spoke to. First, that there is a long, independent, counter-historical tradition of Dalit publishing, of Dalit associational life, and of literary and linguistic experiment. And the Panthers are both folded into that, but they mark a kind of distinctive movement, perhaps away from it or in critical engagement with it. And then I guess the question of the now. We seem to be back in that moment of really needing to think about the work of the literary, literature, and kind of radical prose and poetry in altering the kind of stultified world that we're all confronting. I wonder if maybe Suraj and Yogesh, you each want to take a bit of time to respond to each other's presentations, and then I'll start collecting questions from the audience. We have one, and I'll wait for a few more.
Sure. First of all, thank you, Anu, for summarizing that, and some of the points you make. I just want to, I have like a 4,000 word odd paper, right? And you can see it's all over. It needs to be more disciplined or organized. But this is just what I thought over past 3-4 days. And within that, there is a furious debate happening, especially among Dalit sphere. So there was a question, because Dalit movement never had a manifesto of its own, because every movement needs a manifesto. So where do we find? So it was argued that the Bauddha Sahitya Parishad, Maharashtra Bauddha Sahitya Parishad, Maharashtra Buddhist Literary Conference in Mahad, and the presidential address was to be considered, because it really talked about Dalit not being a revengeful, we are really seeking humanity and we want you to part of it. And it's very much shaping what eventually Dalit Panthers, also described, and very much to that kind of archive of, and I very much acknowledge the critiques of Gangadhar, likes of Gangadhar Panthavane Adsur, and others in for example Raga Zadav also, kind of takes over this obsessive kind of, they were like, this is great, but I guess personally for me to see is there was no reciprocation, and that's been one of my critiques and my sad phase of this, because Black Panther didn't know, or even Black, I think literary sphere, even though MN1 Khede went to probably one of the first Dalits to graduate in American University with a PhD in mid 1960s. When he is really, and he's literally studying Walt Whitman, and this literary kind of space is alternatively, and with Tantrism, Manan Desai has written an excellent paper on MN1 Khede, who really is in many ways the originator of this thought. Janardhan Wagmare goes to him, can you please accept me as your student, I want to do this, and then that's how. And it's very interesting how Janardhan Wagmare draws. So there is a lot of Leroy Jones, and how he appreciates Leroy Jones. There is a lot of class kind of critique, and in much of Dalit writing, class is very central, but they don't want to make capital out of it, because idea of poverty, Babura Bagul, for example, I mean, reading Babura Bagul is like getting high on 3 Red Bulls at the same time, and just want to go and like, I want to fly around and mess up with somebody. That's Bagul, and I think much of the internationalist vision, I think, and my critique, as you very well know, is internal and external, is really to frame a potent thought for future. I'm very much concerned about future, because the future, the archives of the future is what I'm invested in, and to create that, I want to make sure this moment is taken very well care of. That's why a lot of curation, a lot of juxtaposition of history. Unfortunately, I see, and that's the critique of Google programmers and social media warriors, is to really concoct a history, or to create a history. Now one can understand creating myths is important. Babura Bagul already argued the Dalit community needs many myths, because their condition is made by myths, the lower condition. So you really need to come out. And I think in that way, what Yogesh is doing is, I think, phenomenal. To really, it's not just what he's doing, he's actually giving a statement. and that's what I'm saying is, archive of the future will notice that there was at least somebody who raised money from people to publish the books, and publish high quality books. I had great fortune to write 2 endorsement to his Panthers publication, and I will do more as and when comes. But because it's the part of how you recognize the moment, not as the history, not as the template of history, a moment as something you can control. Many of Dalit writers, when they wrote, they didn't just loathed, they just didn't cried always. Of course, there are some people who critique that they did cried a lot, but also what they did was they wanted to own the time. And this is very much Heideggerian phase of Dasein, to really work with how do I calculate. And that's why I differentiate being a Dalit and Dalit being. Both are kind of correlating to each other, and to broader, and to, the point is, whatever this paper that was presented has so many things that were missed out, but I think it really requires a revisiting to see how comparisons even work. If it is just a literary phase, how many times did Janardhan Wagmare visited America, or Black America in that case, right? While Ambedkar had already been in Black America, right where you are, Harlem, So there is much of a time and space and locality that really upends much of the structure. And so I think this is the work that we want to be in.
Lovely. And this is a great chance to move to Yogesh and to speak also to, I think, yes, the very, very important sort of the history that Yogesh you're channeling, but, you know, where you're going with your own publication and what this opens up, and then any other comments that you may have. I think, Suraj, you might have also responded partially to some of the questions that have come up. I'll pose them for both of you, but Yogesh, please take some time to respond in the way that you wish.
Yeah, like what Suraj said about archiving the future, or archiving for the future. Now, a lot of people think that, or like the kind of idea they have about Dalit literature is their idea or their imagination goes back to 70s or 60s. But first, if you understand that if a Dalit literature is an anti-caste sensibility, or it's an attempt or a literary attempt to assert your position as a human being, then we need to go back to 13th century when Chokha Meda wrote his couplets. When God was something a domain of Brahmins. So Chokhamera, as a Mahar man, wrote poetry, asking a god question, even the challenging the dominating or the narratives of Brahmins, asking the god that I'm also a human being. Like, what do you assume myself in your eyes? So that was a exercise in literature by a Dalit man, a Mahar man. So we have a history of, like, if you understand Dalit literature in this sense, then it goes back to 13th century. And then there is a whole tradition of oral history we have. The history, if we understand or listen to the oral history, especially in Maharwadas, like, which is now Buddhavadas, or the Buddhist, the colonies of Buddhists, like the old history, the history which is not written but which is existed as a memory, it is totally contradictory to Brahmanical myths. Where from it comes. you know so we can, then we can relate to Ambedkar's theory that Dalits, or Mahars in the context of Maharashtra, they have never been Hindus. They have nothing to do with Hinduism. you know so it, our oral history says that. Now, the, there has been a lot of potential for decades among Dalit women and Dalit men. And like there is a idiom called in Maharashtra, even especially in the domain of literature, they say that तुम्ही दलित वस्ती जाऊन कोणत्याही घरावर दगड मारा, तिथून एक पोएट बाहेर येतो. You go into a Dalit, like, no, there are poets, like some of them, they don't write, but they are oral poets, like they are very good storytellers. So basically, like they say that you go to the Dalit basti, you throw a stone, wherever it goes, a poet will come out. So this is the kind of potential we have. The only thing is that we did not focus much on creating resources to produce this potential into objectified reality. you know I may be exhausted if I tell you the list of Dalit men and women who every day ask me to publish their poems and all. I mean, there are limitations, but there is massive talent. So my focus is on production. I myself write, but my energy and my focus is much on, because why it is important to produce something, because I think the battle between Brahminism and Buddhism is basically fought by intellectualism. you know so they produce something which make people believe, you need to produce something which shatters the myths of people. That is, and that can only be done when you keep on producing. So the only thing we lack in, so far, are the resources to produce. So my focus, especially when I think about Dalit, the history of Dalit literature, Dalit movement, whether it's political, whether it's social, cultural, we actually have massive talent. There is abundance of talent. There is exodus actually, but we need to focus on resources which can produce these, and I think that will produce a huge challenge in a fight we want to fight against Brahmanism. So this is like, what I think about literature and movement and publication basically.
Fabulous. Thank you. Thank you, Yogesh. I'll pick up on a couple of questions that have come up. I also want to ask you, Yogesh, because because Panther's Paw and the argument that you're making about a kind of a project of mass intellectuality, you say this is going to be fought on the grounds of intellectualism, and about creating the kind of resources to make this other archive, right, available in its fullness, and to really tap into the talents that both you and Suraj describe as a kind of archive of the future, that these are voices, these are movements, these are practices that are really going to be a kind of archive for the future. So using sort of drawing on that, I guess my question is, what distinguishes the literary or literature from life, from ethnography, and just providing the kind of context or the history? So what's literary about Dalit literature, I guess, which is the kind of question that I also have for you, given the experiment with form, with language, with linguistic practice, what you call the untranslatability in some sense of this poetic speech. But but this is my question and I'm being very selfish. I want to just raise a couple of questions that have come up for both of you. There's a question for Yogesh, who wrote and produced Dalit literature before the 60s and the 70s. I think Suraj, in some sense, gestured to that. Suraj, how much is the analysis of Black literature involved in conversation with Black scholars themselves? Moten, very recent, but Henry Louis Gates, but that long tradition of Black scholars or scholars of Francophone and Anglophone diaspora. There's another question, which is, I think, for both of you, which I think is really interesting. It says that the radicalism of the Dalit Panthers really was located in the urban space, but it didn't seem to seep into the rural scenario in its full force. What are the reasons for this? This, I think, is a broad question for both of you. There's a question for Suraj. When we try to analyze this Dalit Black ideological sphere, we come across issues of violence and humiliation, almost similar in both cases. What are the spaces for healing or a level playing field? So what is the kind of writing back? This, I think, is again a question for both of you. One is the radical critique of caste, untouchability, and the body, as both of you, I think, are indicating. The other is, what are the spaces of healing and care and really working with other forms of language and expression in order to redress this from within? There's a question also that Urmila Berdikar would like to ask orally, and that'll be sort of the third question. I'll give each of you a chance to respond to this complex of questions, and then we'll bring our session to a close. Urmila, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah. Thank you, Anu. Thank you so much for allowing me to ask the question. Am I audible at all?
Yes.
Great. So I have a question to both Suraj and Yogesh. As a student of this literature, my question is not a critical question, but more a kind of a studious question. See, I I wonder if we will benefit in this study, because I join you, both of you, in this study. Yeah, I study this. I identify myself as a Savarna woman, so there's no way I can not identify myself as a Savarna woman. But I'm a student of literature, and my question is a very studious question. basically, what I'm trying to look at is the way in which uh, mm, uh, uh, somebody who would convert to Christianity and write a metered poetry not in the mukta chanda, if you understand, and not sort of go along with modernism, but institute a modernism way ahead of this, and which is Reverend Narayan Vaman Tilak. That's whom I'm studying, and I want to ask. I mean, he doesn't really have a connection with America, except that he is sort of converted to American, congregationalism and to various American missions, and he has a huge critique of the racism that's involved in colonialism, in the colonial encounter. How would you place this? This will really sort of guide me in understanding how would you place a poet like Reverend Narayan Vaman Tadak in the poetic tradition that we are trying to look at. And I don't think that we can understand the emergence of the literary and the poetic and within public sphere without looking at this kind of a nexus, without looking at this kind of a genealogy. I don't even want to know nexus. I just want to kind of get the kind of ruptures that I think both of you pointed out, and I'm trying to look at certain genealogies. So that's my question. Thank you very much.
Lovely, thank you. Yogesh, Suraj, please take it away.
Uh, I'm processing actually. Like Suraj, would you like to respond to that?
No problem. Thank you to all the questions for bringing that. Sydney's question is very important. I think so. I make a joke when you go to India and try to identify where are Dalit students studying in the universities. They are mostly in comparative literature. And what are they studying? They're studying Black and Dalit, kind of comparisons. It's almost, but then the emphasis is very much historical. And I think in contemporary era, at least to my limited exposure, I've seen kind of a contemporary writings. I've not seen my mentor Skip Gates being studied. I think he will like that if somebody is doing, because he himself is a literary giant figure. Even Fred Montaigne and many other literary figures. Although there is an interest in ideas of bell hooks, very much kind of a feminist way of looking at things, and people know these words, and Angela Davis's work is there. But in a classical literary sphere, I would like to see more of such kind of a comparative critical work taking place. But I think that really helps us to think how to the question of Sutitra, that about healing, right? How can academia play a part in creating healing space? And I think that's my aim, that's my project. I want to burst the bubble of hybrid binaries, because I don't think there are any original binaries. They're all mixed up, and I really want us to really meet at a place, be it mountaintop or at the bed of mountain, to really converse on healing. Because the idea of protest, an idea of fight, really has a purchase, but there is something after war, after protest. And I think, what is that? And that's why, as I've said, I'm seriously invested in the archive of the future. And to do that, I want us to really make a space of healing. And healing is a very practical, pragmatic method for me, very much in a Buddha's attitudes of how do you really heal. Ashoka did the same. His whole life he was repenting, almost healing what he committed in Kalinga and other brutal wars. So I think the Dalit community's focus has to be healing. And in very much so, the word healing doesn't exist in its obviousness, but I think that's where I want to kind of fill the gap, and to put forward a project where all of us can gather. I said it one day, and this is my aim. I want us to have a grieving conference. I want us people from all quarters of life to come and grieve, publicly cry, cry for each other. I think the idea of letting emotions go for each other's pain has not really found a space, because even tears are weaponized, and much of that tears are weaponized for wrong reasons. So what we want to do is we want to let the soulful experience from internal critique need to be expressed, and really expressed by bouncing off on others' vulnerabilities. I don't want others' vulnerabilities to just go astray. I want to uphold that through this kind of a crying public grieving process. And I think that's kind of one way of doing at it. And I think Florian has asked the question about the Dapper Dalit, showing the Dalit Black Alliance in sartorial. I mean, man, that's how we do. The media, at least in Indian, has been trying to find out the sartorial aspect. They wrote articles on me, but also they wrote articles on Chandrasekhar Azad, and the kind of, because this is very much an Ambedkar's kind of way of looking at and how you develop style, how you present yourself, how you caricature, and I think I enjoy the process of being profiled for something that they never was accorded to Dalits, that is clothes or clean clothes or high brand expensive multi-thousand-dollar suits. I think there is something very particular about that aspect of approach, to really say that now in the aspects of modernity, we can own, we can claim, and we can pride, even when today people are not allowed to wear good clothes. Dalits, if they wear good clothes, they are getting shamed, they are getting hated on. So yes, Florian, to answer your question, yes, there is a space for that, and at least through my personal experience, I'm trying to create a narrative around that, and I think something of that could be here. And that's why Professor Skip Gates, Henry Louis Gates, coined a term, Dafrican. It's his term, Dalit African. And to seeing my hair, he said that's Dafro, Dalit fro. And that's kind of a beautiful osmosis of Dalit Black relations.
Thank you, Suraj. Yogesh.
Yeah. I think there is a question that, like, who wrote Dalit literature before 60s and 70s. I think we spoke on that. Like Suraj shed some light on that. Uh, like it's about, like, what do you understand as Dalit? Like I think I already I already indicated that, like, with the example of Chokha Meda. I would like to respond to the question of, like, healing, and the relation of literature. So if I can, so I would like to respond to that. Can I, Anupama?
The floor is
So
yours.
yeah. I'll tell you my experience of, like, publishing, and then just disseminating, spreading books for 5 years now. Like, we do, like, I do Marathi to English translation and publish, or like we are writing also in English, so we do that. uh, as you can understand, like, most of the people who buy the books are urban savarnas, obviously. For me, this has been an experience. Like, when we say that, when an oppressor reads a story written by an oppressed person, now who heals, you know who needs healing? Because this question is very important. Who is wounded? Who is in pain? Who is not behaving normal, and who needs healing? When people say that, oh, I didn't know this, I didn't know that people live life like this, I did not know the history of the list, they were also like this. I'm like, I started thinking that, actually, who needs healing? uh, the person who is wounded does not assert. I mean, rarely asserts. How can you assert if you are wounded? Your life or energy in your body will be invested or spent in healing. No, you won't reach to the position of assertion. Now, if Dalit, I told you that there is a massive exodus of talent of people who are writing among Dalit community. It is because they are assertive, and I think this healing should be understood or thought about or reflected in connection with the oppressor. I'm not saying that like we as a human being do not need healing. There are like if we say that if we dissect the kinds of healing we need, like there is physical, emotional, or there are mental. All of us are go through this point on time to time in life. All of us suffer and we feel pain. But when we are here talking about the systematic operation by which certain communities are subjected to pain, which is a part and parcel of systematic operation. Now, if there is a systematic operation, there is a community who is, from there that operation is triggered, you know, because their existence is based on oppressing others. Now, the community whose existence are based on oppressing others, that community needs the healing, not the community who are being oppressed. Because getting out of oppression, writing their stories is their way of assertion more than healing. So I think because we all are fundamentally human beings, that's an instinct with which we born, but we are raised as black, white, oriental, all these things categories comes later. So I think that wound is there on the instinct of being a human. We are deracinated from that instinct of basically just a human. So uh, it is not a Dalit who tries to identify who is Brahmin. It is a Brahmin who tries to identify, who puts effort to know that who is who. So basically I think I like to think about healing in terms of oppressors. So this is my actually an experience I have, like I started understanding throughout the 5 years of publication. Thank you.
Yeah, any thoughts on the literature question? There's Malcolm Joseph Nazareth has got a long response to the question about N.V. Tilak, and we'll share that with Urmila Bhirdikar. But if you wanted to respond, maybe Yogesh, to this question of sort of the literary and uh, sort of literary experiment, or what kinds of things maybe even you're seeing, because you're also pointing to a divide between those who read, the circulation and the reception of this writing. And I think very important what you just said: who is it who's buying these publications? What is it that's then happening in terms of that process of reading? But what about in terms of the literary experiment that you see taking shape? There's a question further asking, what is it about Dasal's writing that is untranslatable? Or, Tendulkar talks about the fact that he has no access to that world when he writes about Golgotha. So what is it about that experiment with language, deforming language, with insurgent speech that strikes you? And you read this kind of, you read a poem that sends goosebumps up, I think, everybody's arms, the Dasal poem about his mother. So where do you locate some of those experimental practices, I guess?
Uh, uh, See, one of the aspects of Dasal's poetry is like why there is a huge scope of untranslatability, because I think it is because of the originality. And what is the originality of Dasal's poetry is not about his imagination, but the kind of life and the context in which he lived. And because the life with which of which or about which he has written has been a life which is boycotted, which is secluded by the society, by the so-called moralistic society, the society which follow the morals. So when you and this is also one of the reasons why most of the Dalit literature is also especially in the in any given language, in any vernacular language, is like, growingly or increasingly untranslatable if we go back in the past, because Dalits, I mean, like, untouchables are made to live a certain kind of life. So that certain kind of life gave birth to certain kind of figure of speech, certain kind of idioms, certain kind of imagination, and certain kind of vocabularies. And everything of what Dalits, as a part of their inheritance, they inherit, is something impossible for the language existed to get it translated into that, because there is simply no substitute. There is simply no substitute. So I think, and it is because of, maybe it is a defeat of human society, that we are not able to translate the lives of a few people, because they were subjected to systematic violence and oppression. So we but and in that context, whatever stories need to be translated or can be translated should be translated, because so that we will not miss on the life we live, which will guide us in the future. you know
Uh, I think,
Thank
I
you.
have
Yeah.
just
Mhm.
a quick response to that. I think that's a very profound. See, on the untranslatability, and I think this is the constant push. Even when I'm editing, I get this, and I think the Brahminical dictions were made to legislate Dalit action, and that's why you will see the potency of that language. There has not been a language yet created that can discipline the Dalit rebellion or the Dalit emotion. And that's why it's very difficult to grapple or wrap head around what this person is actually saying, and there are so much loaded terms that to unpack even that three word will take like a, because it has come with that locus of history. And because the Brahminic dictionary never cared for Dalit emotion as a knowledge, it never cared to to describe or to include it into the linguistic phase. It happens in Punjabi literature. It happens in Hindi literature. We of course know from many liter writings, but particularly also in Marathi. I don't know much about South India, and so speaking from this Marathi kind of attitude, there is so much rejection of whatever language means, because even in the accent policing of a hegemon and metropole, there is much rejection by the Dalit sphere, and that's why even the Dalit accents in Bombay, and many try to mimic us. It's very interesting. Like, people say people try to mimic Pune Marathi and stuff, but if you go through the Dalit ghettos, people try to really imitate. We create new words. There are mix of Hindi, sometimes English, and so what it essentially comes down to is the rage and the anger is actually challenging the very dictionaries and the language forms of modalities of conversations of establishing knowledge. Dalits are not meant to be there, and that's why we need a different Dalit dictionary to make sense of their life world. Like we have many dictionaries, and I think there has been a frugal attempt done to write a Dalit dictionary, but we will need more refined aspects. So literature then really becomes literature, or else who gets awards? Many people can't wrap their head around this, right? And that's why it gets difficulties. So if we have that supportive space, I think we can then not only legislate but free Dalit emotions beyond the Brahmin control of their assistance.
Thanks so much. I think we're nearly at the end of time. There was also a mention, you spoke about the Sahitya Parishads. As I said, there's a comment on the first International Marathi Parishad, which was held in January of 2021, which appeared to be a Savarna Hindu affair, which overshadowed the anniversary celebration of the Elgar Parishad. And that's a very complex history of literature, life, words, speech, and their enormous consequence. But just I think to mark out maybe something that Yogesh has also brought up, that the question of production and who the literary producers are on the one hand and the consumers, that there is a kind of great divergence and a divide there. There's a question also about reading Dasal, but Yogesh, if you had any final comments, and Suraj will give each of you just a couple of minutes. We will give you both the last word. I want to thank both of you enormously for giving us your time and sharing your thoughts. I think this is just the beginning of many of the conversations that are starting in this space. So I'm very grateful to both of you for being with us. And I also do want to commemorate the moment of the Dalit Panthers. As I said, this year, going into the next year is a very major anniversary moment to commemorate, to think about, kind of questions of radical care and so on. So please watch this space. But Yogesh and Suraj, you have the last words.
Uh, yeah, I'll end up with reciting one poem of mine. So this is from my book of Operations Body and Mind. And this is about like because I'm talking about literature and stories and all. So let me tell you that the history of our languages, the languages I speak, or the language of my forefathers are very rich. And I think there is no substitute for that in English. But it is also true that like if I'm not able to speak this Queen's language, I may not be able to speak or we may not able to communicate here. So that's it's just a bridge. But then there is also a dilemma. So with that dilemma, I will recite that poem, and I will leave you with the dilemma of mine, like Dalit from Vidarbha, like raised in learnt in Jilla Parishad school, taught in Marathi, but somehow got into this. So this is from this article, English as Personal and Politics. Uh, so I have this poem called, I'll recite this poem. So the poem is, my father sang to me in a language his father taught him. Hence, in it, his rage has had clarity, his love was sublime. But I grew up much greedy. I wrote in English and kept on writing. Later, my father's words turned voiceless to me. I turned deaf to his song. I grew up mean. Today, I imagine if I have a son or daughter, what song shall I sing to them? Precisely in what language shall I sing?
क्या बात है, बहुत बढ़िया, very nice. Untranslatability
Yeah,
of the rage, that's a beautiful
rage.
metaphor.
Yeah.
Well,
Thank you.
Zindabad, Zindabad, that's a powerful one. I think I just want to conclude by saying we are organizing International Dalit Literature Festival next year. Hopefully things go well. It will be the first Dalit International Festival. Location is yet to be decided. But you all are welcome. Keep watch out the space, and Anu and have been discussed. One of my plans is to get the Dalit Panthers who are alive come down to America and make a Dalit Black Panther meet. And I think there is much to that space of action and compassion to go alongside words and letters. Thank you so much. Jai Bhim.
Thank you both very, very much. Jai Bhim to all. And please join us again next week and the week thereafter to speak with poets, sound, song, words. Thank you again,
Thank
both
you,
Yogesh
JB. Thank
and
you.
Suraj, very much.
Thank you.